without sacrificing much in value. I mean, if you're willing to wait 2-3 months, you can probably sell at 747 at its market value, because that's not a very liquid market. It's not like there are people who are in the market for a 747 every single day. Similarly, 100 shares of Google will be liquid, but if you own 1 million shares of Google, that's going to be somewhat harder to sell, or 100 million shares if you own a big percentage of Google. And given that, two major divisions of assets, we're going to call them current assets and fixed assets. Current assets, we're going to abbreviate to CA, are assets that can be converted to cash within a year or an accounting cycle. In the old days, certain firms had accounting cycles longer than a year. Nowadays, it's not much of an issue. Like cash. When we say cash, we're not talking about just paper currency. Demand deposits that are in the banks, also cash. Cash and cash-like instruments. Short-term securities. These could be, relatively liquid things like U.S. Treasury bills, Treasury bonds, or commercial papers. Accounts receivable. A lot of firms, when they do business with their clients, especially corporate clients, they allow them to, they extend trade credit to them. That means, okay, I'm selling you my stuff, but I expect you to pay me within 30 to 90 days. These are receivables, which means you haven't received them, but you expect to receive them. They're relatively liquid. More often than not, you can expect to collect a very high percentage of them. And if you have doubt that you may not be able to collect, you actually have to set aside allowance for doubtful receivables. And typically we look at the net numbers. Next, this order is kind of true for most firms, but for certain firms, inventory may be more liquid than accounts receivable, especially for retail firms. Typically other current assets. It's a generic term. Sometimes you have current assets because you actually prepaid your workers. You paid your workers 3 months ahead of time. You already paid them, but they're supposed to work for the next 3 months. In a sense, that's your asset. As you pay them, you're going to reduce those. Typically, it's kind of in this order. Now, and when we look at the fixed assets, which are booked at historical costs minus accumulated depreciation. Hence, we're gonna actually look at the net fixed assets and use the abbreviation NFA. So total assets at a minimum is equal to current assets plus net fixed assets. And for fixed assets, there are two types. Tangible fixed assets and intangible fixed assets. Tangible fixed assets, as the name suggests, have a separate physical existence. A building, it's there, okay? It has a physical existence, so it's a tangible asset. A factory, a machinery in that factory, computers, that sort of stuff. Intangible fixed assets, though they have value, they don't have a separate physical existence. Among intangibles, things like copyrights, patents, and there is something called goodwill. It's kind of a view kind of asset, but because we do double entry bookkeeping, it comes up. Back in 2005, I believe, Google bought YouTube by paying $1.5 billion. It's such a big fund. I mean, YouTube is probably responsible for at least 1/3 of value of Google. And Google is, how much Google's, let's see. Yeah, Google is worth about $1.26 trillion. So rough estimate of the lower bound for YouTube's separate value, you can think of $400 billion. But Google bought them at $1.5 billion. Obviously invested some money into it, but still. But at the time YouTube was bought, they did not have a single dime in revenue. It was just a repository for videos people put in. It was mostly cat videos those days. But over time, obviously, other content came in. But if you looked at balance sheet of YouTube, it had about $500 million in it. So their net assets were $500 million. But Google paid, 1.5. Well, when we do accounting, when I account for YouTube, my purchase cost is $500 million, right? So I have to write it, YouTube, $500 million. That's my historical acquisition cost. But the trouble is I paid 1.5. So in order for me to balance my books, I need to create what we call a contra asset. And that contra asset is goodwill. In a sense, it's good. It's the value of my goodwill in YouTube. It's the difference between the purchase price and the book value of an acquisition. because book values and market values do not need to be the same. For example, even though it's not in the books, does or did Apple have an asset named Steve Jobs? For all intents and purposes, they did. You know, if Steve Jobs wasn't considered a big asset for Apple, on the day it was announced that Steve Jobs had terminal cancer, I think Apple went down by 5%. You know, 5% of $1 trillion is a lot of money. So in a sense, market attaches $50 billion worth to Steve Jobs. But if you look at Apple's books, there's no item called Steve Jobs. Or technically there is, but it's valued at zero. Accountants don't like showing things valued at zero, so it's not there. And there's good reason for that. For accountants, there is no systematic ways to attach a value to Steve Jobs. So whenever you can't do it, you attach value to zero. You know, I don't know if you notice, accountants typically are conservative approach. You need finance people like us to actually give meanings to it. I always joke with my accounting professor friends, you know, you guys do the books, you actually make them useful. But that's the book value. It's the historical cost minus any accumulated depreciation. You bought a building 30 years ago, it's $1 million. More than likely, in 30 years, it's fully depreciated. So in the books, that building is almost zero. But if you look at it in the market, you can sell it for 50. So market value of things and book value of things are typically different. Almost always market value is higher, but it doesn't have to be.